It was now weeks after Florence's special encounter with Carter Braithwaite. When Florence woke, she nestled her head into her pillow, reliving the moments they'd shared. Helpless to prevent the secret smile that rested on her lips, she pulled the quilt higher until it covered her head in darkness. Sleep had been elusive every night since the delightful kiss that had replayed in her mind no less than 1,000 times. One day, he'd come to the community and want to join them. It wasn't likely, but she could still hope and dream. If it wasn't meant to happen, why had he been placed in front of her? Now, the biggest question was, if Gott wanted her to marry an Amish man, then where was he? Her mind had been continuously tormented by the questions that arose from her attraction to Carter. She didn't feel guilty about sharing that kiss with him. She just didn't. It had been the most wonderful, beautiful thing in the world. Now she knew how wunderbar life could be. Her heart welled with happiness, so much happiness that she wanted to tell someone. But who would understand? Not her best friend, and not any of her family. No one knew about her secret attraction to their neighbor, Carter Braithwaite. All they knew of him was that he lived next door, and that he'd driven her to collect her half-sister, Honor, when she'd foolishly run away with Jonathan. Her stepmother, Wilma, had thought nothing of his kindness. To her, it was reasonable that their neighbor would help them out in a crisis, since they had urgently needed a car and a driver. When they'd kissed, Carter had asked her, almost begged her, to visit him the next day. But in the early hours of the following morning, her common sense had kicked in, and she'd decided against it. Since that kiss, Christmas time had come and gone, and now it was a mid-January morning. Even though fear of the unknown had kept her away from him, that didn't stop her thinking about him every single minute. Part of her hoped he'd knock on her front door and say he couldn't live through another day without her. What would she possibly say to him when she saw him again? What would he expect? How was she supposed to act? It was better to stay away, if she could, for as long as she could. That was what she'd decided. But now, weeks along, her resolve was weakening. She raised her hand, grabbed hold of the hand-stitched quilt, and flung it off her. Then she stretched her arms above her head, letting out a long, sleep-deprived yawn. It was barely light outside. Pre-dawn was the best time for her to grab some peace before her noisy half-sisters woke. After exchanging her nightdress for her day dress, she pulled on her black stockings, apron, and cape, and then sat down on the end of her bed. Pulling her loosely braided thigh-length hair over one shoulder, she undid the braid and slowly began brushing. Then she sectioned, braided, and pinned her hair up before donning her prayer cap and getting to her feet. As she walked down the stairs with her shoes in her hand for quiet's sake, she thought back to the letter she found in the attic, the one her mother had written to her. Her mother had told her not to make the same mistakes that she had made. But what had she meant by that? Exactly what had her mother been trying to tell her, and why hadn't she made it clearer? She'd always assumed her mother and father had been in love. But what if they hadn't been? Even though it wouldn't change anything, somehow it would. Then there was the other letter she'd found, the one written to her mother from a man named Gerald Braithwaite. He had begged her mother not to marry her father, and to leave the Amish to be with him. Was history trying to repeat itself, with her now being tempted by a Braithwaite, who was also an outsider? Carter had claimed to know nothing about a man by the name of Gerald Braithwaite, but to Florence it had seemed more than a coincidence. Florence walked into the quiet kitchen and slowly pushed up the blind to let in the winter morning's light. Then she filled the tea kettle with fresh water and placed it on the stovetop. Once she was sitting down at the kitchen table, she set about figuring how to find out about Eleanor, her mother's name. She knew none of her mother's relatives. The only cousins, aunts, and uncles were those of her father's family or her stepmother's family, and those weren't even blood relatives to her.